What's new?
I'm Zev Elif, Associate Professor of Jewish History at Touro College and Hebrew Theological College, and I'm joined today by Professor Daniel Soyer, Professor of History at Fordham University, someone who has really moved how we conceive, talk, read, and write about the Jewish immigrant experience in the United States, particularly in New York. Wrote a work that really is peerless about the concept of Landsman and Landsmannschaften, really changed how we looked at Jewish units in New York City. And of course, Daniel, you have, together with Annie Pullen, co-authored the second of a 3-volume series on the history of Jews in New York, edited by Deborah Dashmore, that's received a number of awards and has really, I think, set the bar very high for local histories and how we talk about place and people in Jewish life. And thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
So as I read the literature, whereas Oscar Handlin, of course, at Harvard for so many years, and his student Mose Richin just passed away, they understood the immigrant and wrote about the immigrant Jewish experience really as immigrant qua immigrant history. They looked at migration numbers. They situated the Jewish experience among other immigrant groups, Irish and Italian, most specifically. But what you and what so many others have done over the last few decades is broadened the literature, the method, the resources, looked differently at the sources to understand not just migration, but immigrant life.
So, you mentioned that Handlin and Richin put Jewish immigration in the context of broader immigrations. Of course, Handlin, I think, especially did that since he wrote a book about Irish immigrants and wrote kind of a very broad book. His famous book, The Uprooted, which really kind of in some ways leaves out Jewish immigrants, because he kind of, his immigrant in that book is the peasant, the European peasant, and not so much Jews, not so much his own parents. Richin does, much more. His book was The Promised City, was maybe the first, certainly one of the first serious academic books of history about the Eastern European Jewish immigrant experience. But one thing I think that's important is to look at Yiddish and what happens to Yiddish in New York and other places in the United States as well. I think especially New York, just because of the concentration, of Jews here, both in terms of numbers and percentage of the population, in relation to other groups. So, for example, these Yiddish-speaking Jews come over, and they're not alone. They're not the only people in the city. They come in contact with not only, native-born Anglo-Americans or whatever that may have been, but previous immigrant groups as well. And I think for the immigrant Jews, the Eastern European Jews, probably the most important other immigrant group, aside from the Italians who came at the same time, more or less, were the Germans. So New York was, I think, the third or fourth largest German city in the world, speaking city in the world, in the late 19th century. And of course, Yiddish is a Germanic language, and it always had kind of low social status, even among its own speakers. And many people, even Yiddish speakers, at that time considered it a kind of dialect of German anyway. And, you can kind of communicate maybe a little bit, especially if you're, very conscious of, the etymology of your words, and fake it, you can speak a little German. And so New York Yiddish, especially in its more formal, I don't think people talking in their, in their living rooms, it was like this, but in more formal settings, at Landsmannschaft meetings, at his hometown society meetings, or especially in the minutes, where it was written down, and also in the socialist and labor world, there's a lot of borrowing from German. This happened in Europe too, but I think there was a direct connection here because of the direct connection that say, Yiddish-speaking radicals had with the German-speaking radicals. Abraham Kahan talks about this, that they would go to German meetings, they would read the German socialist newspapers, and Kahan actually in his autobiography says, because this is where we learned our vocabulary to speak about these things. Conversely, Yiddish influenced, and of course Yiddish absorbed all kinds of English. And H.L. Mencken, in his book, The American Language, has a whole section, a whole chapter or section talking about the influence of English on Yiddish. He has like all kinds of examples of Yiddish sentences which incorporate all kinds of English words and English expressions and things like this. But then the converse is also true. Mencken talks about the influence of Yiddish on American and especially New York English. And he says that many New Yorkers, and not just Jews, understand dozens of Yiddish words, because after all, Jews were a third of the population almost. And there are books, a book by Jennifer Guglielmo talks about Italian women, and she mentions a couple of them who spoke good Yiddish because they spoke to, because they hung out with their neighbors. I haven't found any evidence of influence of Italian on American or New York Yiddish.
Interesting.
Which is interesting. I don't know why that would be, but I haven't seen anyone mention it.
What?
I would say one thing is that that's also something, this connection, it may be something that is missing when we're talking about like the culture for Irving Howe's book from 1976, World of Our Fathers, which in academic circles, sometimes a little bit maligned. He wasn't exactly an academically trained historian, but I think it's a brilliant book. And one of the things some people don't like about it is he really concentrates on the things that he's interested in. But he's interested in Yiddish culture. So he talks a lot about Yiddish culture and how it grows up in New York, whether it's theater, literature, press, and so on. But sometimes it seems, I think, like it's a little bit in isolation. Like there's this Yiddish culture and these Jewish immigrants, and it's not so much interacting with the surroundings. So I think something that I know I've tried to do, I don't know how successfully, and other people try to do, is to kind of show more how, both the distinctiveness of the culture, but also the interaction with the city, with other ethnic groups and with kind of bigger structures and with bigger American culture and so on.
And so that's actually quite similar to your work on Landsmannschaft and these societies that Jewish particular groups from Eastern Europe, what you've shown and what Richard shown back in the 1960s is that not all of Eastern Europe was the same. And in fact, they migrated as Bialystalkers lived. There's a wonderful map in Richard's Promise City book, which is so lovely because you understood Jewish Bialystalkers did not settle with the Hungarian or the Romanian Jews. And these Landsmannschaften were very useful as synagogue spaces, as social spaces, to both simultaneously set up borders, or ethnic and cultural and religious borders. At the same time, these Landsmannschaften, they allowed conversation. They allowed Jews to operate as entities and speak both intra-Jewishly, but also outside politically and culturally. And Yiddish, it seems, as a language and as a culture, does much of the same.
So I think, yes, so the Landsmannschaften are interesting. And you mentioned Richard's map, which I think I also reprinted because it showed what I wanted to show. That there are, of course, migration chains. This is not a new thing, despite what we hear, and it's not an insidious thing. It's how migration works. And so people follow their relatives and their neighbors and their friends to these new places, and they often establish formal organizations in the new place based on their old place origin. And so Jews did that too. And so in all the, in Chicago and New York and Baltimore, there were everywhere that there was a significant Jewish community, it subdivided, sometimes very minutely, into these little societies based on town of origin, and as people, you could feel comfortable with people. You know them, a lot of times you knew them since childhood, and you could be comfortable with them. You speak the same dialect of Yiddish as they do. Some societies were religious, some weren't, but if they were, then maybe they used the same nusach, the same style of prayer. So these were very important organizations, but at the same time, they're also the building blocks of the larger community, because there might be, in New York, there were thousands of these little organizations, but then they form federations of the regional one, the Polish Federation, the Galician Federation, Hungarian Federation. And then those help to form even bigger structures like the short-lived York Yiddish, the effort to establish an overarching Jewish community in New York. So they exist on kind of all these levels. They also, depending on their orientations, but they supported their members sometimes if their members went on strike. So they had the kind of broader social and political ramifications. And of course, their language was Yiddish, but they were very American organizations. So their constitutions printed in Yiddish are American constitutions. There were even handbooks in Yiddish, how to form an organization, how to model your constitution. And they start off, at least one of them starts off, well, we live in a republic and we have a constitution, so you should have a constitution too. Okay. So these things which seem so insular are really, again, part of the larger world.
Right. I recall in the foreword every couple of years, they would republish a baseball diamond.
The famous baseball article.
With the Yiddish moment. Right. So when we think about Yiddish in particular, there's it's free. The language is freighted with so much culture. How did the migration, the cultural migration of Yiddish to the United States? We talked about the interplay of English and Yiddish in America and Eastern Europe, in all of its different subdivisions. How did that move the immigration process forward once they actually landed and settled in this case, the Lower East Side?
Well, so Yiddish was simply their language, and their press, and their many of their political activities or educational activities were in Yiddish. But Yiddish was then a vehicle for absorbing a lot of American culture and a lot of American values. I think immigrants they Americanize themselves, but they Americanize themselves on their own grounds, right? They Americanize, they take what they want. So let's say they want to keep their language. They want to keep some sense of Jewishness and Jewish distinctiveness, although of course there were, as there always are, many different versions of that contending. But I think a lot of what they absorbed was this kind of democratic, egalitarian ethos. And a lot of these, certainly the Landsmannschaft and a lot of the left wing, especially political movements, were in some ways revolts against traditional Jewish life and traditional Jewish communal structures. So this was true in Europe also, in Eastern Europe, what was going on at the same time. But here there was maybe more ways to express it.
Then why retain Yiddish at all? It seems to me that what you're also doing is complicating the notion of Americanization. It's not assimilation, but it's a much more of a convergence, a coalescence.
That's what I think. I think that there's, during World War I, there was a lot of course, there was a large immigrant population in general, and there was a lot of government propaganda in the various immigrant languages because they knew that here there are these populations and they are becoming American. We want them to become American, but they can do so. You can buy war bonds in Italian. You can buy war bonds in Yiddish. So there's I think among the immigrants there is a sense of pluralism, American pluralism. If there are contending ways of looking at Americanness or American national identity, and one of them is Anglo conformity, and then there's kind of a middle of a melting pot or ideal, which is somehow that everyone gets melted down and maybe something slightly new comes out, but everything is still uniform in the end. There's also this pluralist conception, which is America as a kind of federation of nationalities which share certain values and certain ideals, but which can retain a lot of the specifics of their individual cultures. And I think this is often, I won't say always, but often the way that immigrants think, prefer to think of the way they become American. And part of it, of course, is just practical. It's not always so easy for everyone to really learn a new language so completely. And so they continue with their language and their means of expression and their means of, the medium through which they learn and so on and express themselves. But there was a transition, and many people did make a transition to English. And so it's true that by the 1920s, for example, the circulation of the Yiddish press is declining as people, even if they're speaking Yiddish at home, they're starting to read the English press. So, over time, there is a little bit of a transition from Yiddish to English. And of course, in the second generation, it's much more marked, and the American-born generation grows up being educated in English and makes a real transition to English being their primary language. Although, we've seen in works by Jeffrey Chandler, most famously, and so on, Yiddish into the 21st century continues to have a kind of he calls post-vernacular. It means people don't speak it, They may not even be able to speak it, but they know a lot of words. It influences American Jewish English, and it still has a lot of kind of symbolic meaning for people.
But as a vehicle, it's very different from when we started in the decades surrounding the 20th century.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks for clicking and learning. And here are some links to related videos. And subscribe. Don't miss out to making meaning of the past in the present for the future.